thank you all for joining us today for CSD's regular Defense and Democracy Dialogue. We're meeting at a moment of profound geopolitical flux, a moment in which developments in Ukraine, that started in Ukraine, in Europe, in Venezuela, are no isolated events, but interconnected expressions of a deeper reconfiguration of global power, institutions, and democratic resilience. The recent change in Venezuela is more than a dramatic headline. It is a strategic response by the United States to decades of Russian and Chinese encroachment in the Western Hemisphere, an attempt to reclaim influence in a region where great power competition has long played out, not just in security terms, but in economic networks, energy flows, and institutional capture. And let me say why I think CSD is and our European experience is particularly important in that context. Europe's experience over the last 3 decades offers something unique in the modern world, which is a sustained, peaceful transition from autocracy to democracy, and we know how difficult that is. And what we actually witness at the moment in Ukraine is that this model of peaceful democratic transition is under pressure as the country defends itself, both its territorial integrity and its democratic aspirations. Hence, today's discussion asks a simple but profound question: how do defense, democracy, and geoeconomics intersect at this pivotal moment? How can democratic societies from the Americas to Europe respond effectively to authoritarian revisionism without abandoning the principles that underpin legitimate, peaceful institutions? We're very thankful that a lot of friends join us today for this discussion, because we really think it's an important element that we manage to preserve, rebuild, rebalance our transatlantic relations in the hope of actually bringing peace and prosperity across the world. And I think starting with Latin America is really important, where CSD in the past 24 to 36 months has done a lot of detailed analysis on the situation on the ground. And I think we're looking forward to a really interesting discussions. Thanks everyone for joining us. Also, thanks specifically to Carla Filippetti, who just joined also the NED board, but we've had long work together. It is my pleasure now, first to welcome all of you to this Defense and Democracy Dialogue, and to give the floor to dear Associate Fellow Estefania Melendez, who has given us a unique touch and information from the ground in Venezuela, but also working on the transnational implications of what has been going on in Venezuela. Estefania, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ruslan, for this introduction. And well, good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm very happy to join this event. I think, as you said, very important moment to have it. And well, thank you for joining in for the Center of the Study of Democracy. This event is in partnership with Transparencia Venezuela. And well, we have a very interesting discussion ahead. Today marks 1 month since the capture of Nicolas Maduro. I still cannot believe it happened finally. So this event reverberated well beyond Venezuela, and well, it immediately raised profound questions about power, legitimacy, and the rules of the hemispheric order. So for many Venezuelans, this moment has also brought a renewed sense, however, cautious, of hope that democratic aspiration feel more realistic. Hope so. However, the purpose, as Ruslan said, today will be to examine what this turning point may mean for the geopolitics and geoeconomics of the Western Hemisphere. Let's say how influence, incentive, and new alignments could shift across the Americas, and what this implies for energy markets, sanction enforcement, and great power competition. So today we are grateful to have with us a highly distinguished panel of experts. I want to welcome our dear Carrie Filippetti. She worked with us previously as Assistant Secretary for Cuba and Venezuela, as a Deputy Representative of Venezuela in the U.S. Department. And now, well, Carrie belongs to the Board of Directors of the National Endowment for Democracy. So thank you, Carrie, for having you here. We had announced we will have Merche de Freitas from Transparencia, Venezuela. Unfortunately, she won't be able to join us today, but we will have with us Christy Rangel. She is research coordinator in Transparencia, Venezuela, and she will give us more insights. And my colleague, Martin Vladimir from CSD, he's Director of Geoeconomics Program. So just for let you know to the audience, we will reserve a time for questions and answers at the end. So please feel free to submit your questions in the chat function, and well, you can indicate there to which panelist your question is directed to. Well, I will do my best to put these questions as possible. So let's begin. Now I would like to make one first question that will be general for each of the speakers. I would like to know your opinion after this event of the capture of Maduro. As we say, it may be considered a turning point for geopolitics in the Western Hemisphere. So I would like to know, in your view, what are the most significant political and economic consequences for the region following the U.S. direct intervention in Venezuela? And how do you see it? Does this represent a structural break from the existing Western Hemisphere order? And if so, how will the potential rebalancing of power affect the different countries in the regions? So I would like to give the floor to our dear guest, Carrie Filippetti. Can you give us your view on this? Thank you.
Sure. Well, first of all, it's great to be here. I'm really honored to be here with CSD. I really value and admire the work that you all have done specifically on Russia's nefarious influence around the world, and really honored also to be here with Christy. Her organization does really important work on the ground in Venezuela and reporting on Venezuela. So the way that I would answer, whether this is a shift is it does depend on what happens next. So there are many moments in history where there was an operation which was successful, and then ultimately it was unsuccessful strategically over the long term. And so whether this is a success for the United States is going to be hugely dependent on whether or not we see a return to democracy inside Venezuela. When I was working in the first Trump administration, we were really aware that the instability that was causing our focus on Venezuela, the drug trafficking, the human trafficking, the rise of China, Russia, and Iran, was due not by the existence of Nicolas Maduro himself, but by the Maduro regime. And that Maduro regime is still in power, even if it's doing business as Delcy Rodriguez. And so making sure that there are incentives put in place, whether privately or publicly, to insist on a return to democratic principles and ultimately to slowly move them to a position where they can have free and fair elections. That is the only way to safeguard both American interests as well as Venezuelan interests. And that will also determine whether or not this becomes a success or whether it just becomes a sort of opportunity for the United States to make a little bit of money and then move on, but not address the root causes of what's happening in the region. In terms of kind of what we're seeing, I would say there's policy and rhetoric. After Operation Absolute Resolve, I thought it was a really important sign to the international community that the United States was willing to use the force of its power to fulfill its objectives, which is something that, the Biden administration, the first Trump administration, we spoke about the importance of democracy in Venezuela, but there wasn't that action to actually make sure that it happened and ensure that there's accountability. And so Venezuela, because of absolute resolve, has a unique opportunity to see both justice, which is the indictment and arrest of Nicolas Maduro, as well as hopefully democracy, whereas many countries have to choose between those two things going forward. At the same time, we immediately used the rhetoric about, forcing our adversaries and standing up for our own principles. That immediately got distracted by what was happening in Greenland, as opposed to refocusing that attention and that threat against our adversaries like Russia and Iran, for example. So moments like that, where we could really use this rhetoric to focus on our adversaries and reassert American strength and leadership and commitment to principle, unfortunately, sometimes can get distracted by other priorities. To sort of summarize this answer to, is this a structural break? I don't think it's necessarily a structural break, but I think it does do something really important. For years, the international system was predicated on really important principles of human rights and democracy and peace among the nations, but it never actually had the wherewithal to ensure those things. So people will look at what President Trump did with Maduro and say, well, this was against the rule of law. I'm not an international lawyer, so I don't know whether it was or not, but it certainly is the case that it shouldn't have been, because that means that the Venezuelan people would have had no recourse under international law to get rid of a dictator who had been usurping authority for over a decade. So this is sort of people say that it's a breaking of the international system, but it's really an acknowledgement that that system is broken and an opportunity to potentially rebuild the system in a way that actually has enforcement mechanisms to ensure that there is recourse for people in Venezuela, for people in Iran, for people around the world, and that there is a country, whether it's the United States or someone else, that's willing to, observe the responsibility to protect and really take that seriously. So I think that's a key way that things could change. Again, if we do see a pivot towards democracy, I think this reflects a clear change in the idea of sovereignty. President Trump is really focused on sovereignty, but it's not just about borders. It's also about economic sovereignty, being free of coercive influence from our adversaries. And I think we see that in his demands for minerals from Greenland and Ukraine and oil from Venezuela. These are ways for the United States to try to not be subservient to other adversarial countries. So I think we're seeing a lot of different innovations in the American system and in the international system, but whether or not they stick will really be dependent on if we do see that change and transition into a democracy or not.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It has been very important what you just highlight, all this, what can be. It can be, but if we can have a path to democracy, I think this is one of the main goals to reach it. I would like to hear my colleague Martin Vladimirov. So the floor is yours. Give us your view on that.
Thank you, Stefania, and thank you, Kari. I'll pick up the discussion where you left off on economic sovereignty and economic security. And I think the ousting of Nicolas Maduro could be the beginning of this broader US attempt to realign Latin America geoeconomically and limit the ability of key adversaries such as Russia and China to use the region as a pressure point in different strategic sectors. And so Venezuela could be only the beginning of a broader shift, a broader domino effect. I mean, we are seeing right now that Cuba is also under significant pressure, similarly to Venezuela. And so the US willingness to use different instruments of coercion to undermine kind of the axis of authoritarian power in the region would have a profound effect on how the region develops economically and also where its kind of main priorities strategically would be. This is not to say that this strategy would be necessarily successful immediately. The verdict is still not out. But we see a much more consistent pattern than previously. And so the main logic here would be that the US and the EU countries have, in a way, lost some of their access to strategic decision-making processes in many of the countries of the region. If we look at the statistics, the whole Latin American region has turned away from its close economic ties with the US. If in 2010, the US was by far the biggest economic partner and trade partner of most Latin American countries, now this is China, with few exceptions, such as Mexico, which is more natural, of course. So there has been a geoeconomic shift in priorities of many of these countries, and the trade ties have been followed by also aggressive investment in strategic areas such as port and road infrastructure, oil and gas, critical raw materials, all of these elements that would underpin the future economic and political development of the region. So in a way, the West has lost its focus on the Western Hemisphere, and has allowed both China and Russia to lock in these countries in long-term asymmetric deals that are usually also very much dependent on debt, and these debt traps can turn these countries in a subservient position, can put them in subservient position vis-a-vis China and Russia, and this could have a broader effect on the ability of these countries to project power globally. So what happens in Latin America should not be an isolated case. It's very much reflected in Asia. It's very much reflected in Africa. It shows a global pattern in a way. So what are the main, I think, areas where we might see geoeconomic realignment? One, and the first is energy. So we see already commodity markets shifting significantly in response to what is going on in Venezuela. Oil flows could be disrupted in the region. And so, for example, Russia used to have a very large footprint into the supply of petroleum products to places like Brazil, Bolivia, Argentina, and other countries. Venezuela, of course, a major supplier to Cuba, but also to other countries. The US has lost a lot of these markets, and now we might see a kind of a reallocation of market power there. Then I would say in critical raw materials, many of the countries' long-term plans for exploring key metals such as lithium, zinc, iron ore, and others would be now in the hands of Russian and Chinese state-owned companies. This may be changing now if they see a geostrategic imperative to cancel some of these deals. By the way, many of these deals have been very corrupt. They have been linked to state capture practices, lack of transparency, lack of competition. It hasn't been a fair game the way Russian and Chinese companies have won these contracts. So this geoeconomic realignment is also based on a level playing field, which is not existing right now in the region. And the third, I think, main element is the development of cutting-edge new technologies. So Argentina, for example, is zooming in on AI development and the links between AI and nuclear energy. And I think cooperation in these fields will be driven by US investment and US involvement. China has been also very much involved in this, but I think the US has an edge. And we'll see whether some of the new political developments, especially in South America, in Bolivia, Argentina, as I mentioned, Paraguay, and Chile, whether this would lead to the reassessment of these economic priorities and a closer alignment with the investment strategies of some of the largest US companies in the region. Let's not forget, yes, I don't want to exaggerate China and Russia. Let's not forget the US is still by far the biggest investor in the region, $1.3 trillion and more. double the amount that Russia and China have. But it's more dispersed. So there is not much of a strategy behind some of these investments. So in a way, what is happening now with Venezuela and the broader region is an attempt to synchronize the political and economic imperatives in one coherent long-term strategy. And this is the first time in a long period when we see the US really focused on this goal. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin, for your answer on that. I would like to give the floor to Christy. Please give us your view on that.
Thank you, Stefania. Thank you very much for this invitation. It's my pleasure to be here, and thank you for making it possible to Transparencia Venezuela participate in this important forum. Well, the impact of this a month ago shock has been profound. A new reality has emerged, one that extends far beyond the Western Hemisphere. Its reach is global. The US direct intervention in Venezuela has exposed rather than create, as is what said before, a structural crisis in the international system. Long-standing doubts about the effectiveness of international organizations have now been confirmed. These institutions have proven unable to enforce even their most basic founding principles, let alone the complex normative frameworks for rights protection developed over recent decades. For years, autocratic regimes were allowed to manipulate the concepts of sovereignty and self-determination, using international assemblies and councils to shield their interests, the interests of corrupt and oppressive elites. The consolidation of resilient kleptocracies reflects their capacity to adapt. These regimes collaborate with organized crimes, exchange lessons learned, invest heavily in domestic and global propaganda, exploit technology to expand social control, systematically appropriate public resources, and then use sophisticated money laundering schemes. International human rights systems documented and denounced this abuse, but they failed to prevent the capture of the state by kleptocratic elites in Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, between other countries. These elites have violated sovereignty for decades, often with little regional or international reaction. Only after US intervention did sovereignty become a central concern, revealing a troubling inconsistency in how international norms are invoked and defended. Politically, this intervention has accelerated a rebalancing of power that is already reshaping the region. Countries with weak institutions and limited strategic vision, for instance, regarding cooperation against corruption or transnational organized crime, find themselves at a clear disadvantage. Economically, the region faces heightened uncertainty, increased exposure to geopolitical bargaining, and reduced policy autonomy. Yet, this moment also presents an opportunity. Latin America can pursue greater autonomy by reviving existing integration mechanisms or creating new ones that genuinely respond to shared interests, universal rights, and democratic governance. Without such efforts, the region risks remaining trapped in international relations defined by transactional pressures, whether from China, Russia, or the United States, The crisis is therefore a call to action. It challenged liberal democracies, members of universal and regional protection systems, and civil society to rethink and, in some cases, reinvent their roles, upholding the international normative framework and reclaiming a central role in the ongoing reconfiguration of the international order is no longer optional. So I will leave here for this first intervention. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christy. I would like to remind to the audience, you can leave questions in the chat so we can share it with the panelists at the end of the event. So I would like to ask Carrie, how do you think will be the next steps of the Trump administrations in Latin America? Let's say focusing in some regional key players, Mexico, for example, Colombia or Brazil. We have seen that there is a wave of change, a political change in the region. We even received very good news recently from Costa Rica, for example. Seems that will be also in that direction. But what about these countries? In your view, could the US action somehow encourage these countries or some other countries in the region to deepen ties with China that may seek stability, investment, or policy continuity? And how should Washington manage that risk? What do you think about it?
Sure, thank you. Those are all really important questions. Maybe I'll start with the question of deepening ties with China. And this goes back to why I think it is so central to U.S. national security interests that we do push for democratic reform. Again, this doesn't mean, say, Edmundo Gonzalez has won, send him to Miraflores. Both Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo Gonzalez, who is the president-elect, have said that they are very willing to do another election. They have the support of the people. But the importance is the steps to get there. And this is where Christy's really an expert, but making sure that there's a new National Electoral Council, making sure that they actually have a National Assembly that has the authority to make decisions, making sure that they have a Supreme Court that is not just staffed by Maduro insiders, checking all the machines. I mean, there's a lot of work to be done. And the reason I say it's so important is going back to Martine's point, which is U.S. investment is going to be central here, both to Venezuela's success, also to if we are going to see sort of new ways for the United States to engage with the region. But our companies are not going to be investing in this region if there's not the rule of law. We already saw some commentary from oil executives that they would be uncomfortable with that. Let's not forget, Delcy Rodriguez's father was put in prison for the crime of abducting and holding hostage an American businessman in Venezuela. This is her origin story. And so if we really want to make sure that we see the security results that we as Americans want to see in Venezuela, there needs to be democracy. That ties to China as well, because we have seen how China and Russia and others have tried to take advantage of what I will admit is often problematic rhetoric coming from the United States, and say that this is the United States being imperialist, this is bullying, we saw this in China's most recent white paper, which they issued just about, I think, a couple days after the U.S. national security strategy came out, where they alluded to great power bullying from the United States. And so China wants to take advantage of this rhetoric, and the way that we can make sure that we protect against China's incursion is to make sure that we have the rule of law and to solidify our commitment to democracy so that the people understand that this is not about stealing the oil like every other country has done, but really about the people of Venezuela. So it serves multiple different purposes. And I think that is a core way to make sure that China stays out of the region. We already know China is deeply invested into Venezuela and is one of the core mechanisms that empowers their repression apparatus, much as they do in Iran as well. So there is a lot of innocent blood on the hands of Chinese companies companies that I hope the United States will at the very least choose to sanction. In terms of the question about what our next steps are in the region. So one, I'm always reluctant to try to predict too much of what President Trump is going to do. He is very idiosyncratic. I think he views this as a real strength that nobody knows exactly what he's going to do. Sometimes he says he's going to attack and he really means it, as with Nicolas Maduro. Other times he says he's going to do something and he uses that as a jumping off point for a future negotiation. One of the things that I always encourage people to do and read Trump 1 was to read The Art of the Deal, where he specifically says this: throw out some crazy idea that's completely radical to set people off kilter, and then negotiate to something more normative. I think you can see this happening in Panama when he threatened an invasion. You can see this happening in Greenland where he threatened an invasion. I think in some instances he's doing this for the sort of upper hand in a more diplomatic or economic negotiation. So the things to remember about President Trump as we think about what his next steps could be: number one is his desire to make sure that the U.S. is fully sovereign, which does mean, again, in his worldview, having access to resources that will make sure that we don't have to be dependent on China or other countries the way Europe was dependent on Russian oil and gas, limiting their response in the Ukraine war. The other thing to remember about President Trump's foreign policy is that he tends to view countries through the lens of their leaders, not the historical relationship between the country and the United States. The best example of this is Petro in Colombia, where Colombia is one of the strongest allies to the United States in the region, economically, diplomatically, etc. President Trump has no respect for Petro. He has many, I will say, legitimate reasons why, but this is why he has focused on Petro, who has failed to achieve his counter-narcotics objectives with the U.S. administration. And President Trump doesn't look at the historical legacy of the connection between Colombia and the United States. He just looks at the leader. He just looks at Petro. So this is a real opportunity for countries that may not have had a strong relationship with the United States in the past, but do have a leader that knows how to engage President Trump, to develop a deeper relationship. At the same time, it can be a challenge for other countries that maybe have had a long-standing historical relationship, but maybe don't have a great relationship with the president right now. The reason I bring that up is because it's very central as we talk about Mexico, as we talk about Colombia, and also that some of these countries will have elections coming up, which I think will also influence what the president does. The last country that I would just mention is Cuba. There's been a lot of speculation that the United States would perhaps try something similar to what we did in Venezuela and Cuba. I would personally be surprised if we did something similar to what we did with Maduro. There's a number of different reasons for why I would be surprised by it, but I will say one of the functioning theories in the first administration was, if Maduro goes, Cuba will fall, not because we will invade, but because it will naturally fall if it is restricted enough. And now President Trump basically making sure that Mexico is no longer providing oil to Cuba. This all goes back to the historical idea of, if you can isolate the regime enough and it can't provide for its people, either the regime will fall, the people will revolt, or they will need to engage in certain economic reform. So I think they're following that same strategy because obviously Cuba has always relied on a patron to survive. Whether that will be a successful strategy or not, we will just have to see. But I do think that is more of a natural outcome of, in their view, a natural outcome of Maduro leaving, rather than a threat that we're going to invade Cuba. The only thing that I would add, sorry, I feel like I've been talking a long time. I do think it's really important as we talk about countering malign influence in the region, Russia, China, Iran, that we do spend just a second on soft power. The reason why so many of these countries are partnering with China and so on is because they can't get U.S. businesses to want to engage. Oftentimes, up until recently, U.S. investment vehicles like the DFC were prohibitively challenging for countries in the region to partner with. And we also ended a lot of our programs via USAID and others that were doing things like taking Huawei infrastructure out of Latin American countries and replacing it with allied equipment. That sort of thing, fighting the information operations through VOA, and so on, which we saw when VOA Farsi came back online after Midnight Hammer. These are really critical things for us to have in place before a massive moment like Absolute Resolve or Midnight Hammer, so that we can take advantage of that and counter both the propaganda of the country as well as the propaganda of Russia, China, and Iran.
Thank you very much, Carrie. It has been very, very good to hear that. I just want to mention about Cuba. I just read some news about Lavrov saying they will come on help to give some economic help. I do believe they are not really in that position to help anyone.
I'll just say they didn't help Iran after Midnight Hammer. They didn't help Venezuela after Absolute Resolve. So they have really shown themselves to be a paper tiger. I'm not surprised they say they'll help, but I doubt that they'll do anything.
Yeah, exactly. So Martin, I believe you're familiar with this plan that Secretary Rubio has shared with us about how they see the short, medium term, and in the long term, the situation in Venezuela. He described it in 3 phases: stabilization, recovery, and then transition. So right now we are on this stabilization process, which means there are already some reforms underway. I don't know if you're familiar with, in Venezuela, they already changed their law on hydrocarbons to start to negotiate this oil with the United States in a completely different way than it used to be, even from the 76, destroying completely the Chavez era, let's say. But my question on that, I know about your experience with Russia and with the sanctions against Russian aggression to Ukraine. You're very expert on how this loopholes looks like and how they evade sanctions. So taking all this into account, if you will have to advise policymakers on this point right now, on this stabilization and recovery process, what will be the priorities or even things to avoid, let's say, to effectively keep that Russian and Chinese influence disrupted over time? Because, well, you know, with China, we had this debt is about $15,000 million, but the Russians have strategic assets there. They have companies in Venezuela. I heard some comments about the Russian ambassador to Venezuela saying on the new law, they will continue operating because they have these rights that they actually signed just months ago, ratified. So what would be your advice on that?
Well, it's very difficult to advise the US government in this very sensitive moment. But maybe as a general comment, if the Trump administration would like to roll back some of the malign economic and political influence of Russia, China, and Iran, it's important to match coercion with credible economic incentives and also a promising pathway to democratic transition, as Kari mentioned. I mean, this is very important, and it would kind of strengthen also the soft power projection of the US. This is key. If some of these countries are not going to basically shift back to China or even deepen their ties. But more practically on sanctions and on economic reform, I mean, CSD has done a detailed assessment of state capture risks in different strategic sectors of Mexico, Argentina, Venezuela, and Bolivia, so 4 big energy and minerals producers. And there is a pattern that we see everywhere, which is that there is a fusion between economic control of resources and political power. So liberalizing strategic sectors, which have become a source of grand corruption, a source of entrenching powerful oligarchic elites in these countries, is the first step to geoeconomic realignment. So opening up the oil sector in Venezuela would be important, would be key to allow private investment to enter, to allow for modernization to happen. If the US wants Venezuelan oil output to increase back to its record levels from the 1970s, this would not happen without a significant opening up of how the oil market and how it functions internally. One interesting example from Europe is the follow-up to the US sanctions on Lukoil. And I want to mention that specifically in the case of Bulgaria because it shows one model to kind of improve and balance the situation after there has been a coercive action against a strategic sector or strategic company. Well, in Bulgaria, the government introduced a special manager which will govern the assets under control of the Russian oil company, Lukoil. This special manager has the obligation of ensuring that no financial flows reach Russia and reach the Kremlin, and that there will be a transparent market-based sale of these assets to a new investor that's not linked to Russia and that's not linked to state capture. And in that sense, I think in Venezuela, it will be important to have a direct partnership on the government-to-government level between the US and the Venezuelan government on managing this transition process within the oil sector and other strategic areas. This would help prevent local oligarchs and the regime basically brokers to tap into the control of these resources. So I will not be surprised if the current government of Delcy Rodriguez tries to capture some of these new private companies that will be trading the Venezuelan oil to the global market. And this kind of vicious cycle of corruption and siphoning off of public funds in Venezuela would be again exacerbated. So this is a very sensitive time. It's a very important moment for the US to step in also in terms of providing governance solutions, governance pathways to how to improve the management of the energy sector, the management of critical infrastructure. And this would be actually a more powerful long-term instrument to prevent China, Russia, and Iran to capture some of these sectors because they will not be able to compete on a level playing field without using corruption, without using their political influence over decision making to win contracts, to win concessions, to win different deals. So this is a viable way forward. We are seeing that already happening in Argentina. I must say the Argentinian energy sector has been experiencing a huge renaissance thanks to the profound market liberalization reforms there. These things might be repeated now in Bolivia, hopefully also in Mexico and Colombia and other key markets, because this would usher a new era also of economic development. And fast economic development would limit the incentive of these governments to seek, I would say, the easy way out, which is to lock it themselves in this geostrategic relationship based on corruption, based on political influence and informal networks as well, instead of actually long-term alignment with the West.
Thank you very much, Martin, for your answer. And I think what you have just highlighted is very much related with what I want to ask Christy right now, because I would like to make her a question from the governance and accountability perspective. Christy, how should we interpret the current moment in Venezuela Is this transition under external management or a contest restructuring of the domestic power? It might be. We still don't know. But do you expect Russia and China to actually retain meaningful influence despite these institutional changes already underway? And finally, because I know that Transparencia Venezuela has been issuing very important statements and demanding important steps about accountability. Is this oil reforms and preferential crude sales to the US move forward? What will that mean for the state capture risk, and which institutional weaknesses should be addressed first to prevent that recapture? Christy.
Thank you, Estefania. Well, the first question, there are too many questions for only 5 minutes.
Yes, sorry.
Well, the current moment in Venezuela is better understood as external tutelage rather than a genuine political transition. The regime is operating under US oversight in key areas: the management of oil production and commercialization, the use of revenues derived from oil sales, decisions regarding political prisoners, and attempts to influence Venezuela's international relations. External pressure has produced tangible results. Well, Maduro and Celia in jail is a very tangible result, but most notably the release of hundreds of political prisoners. In the case of foreign government deposit funds, it remains unclear how the US Secretary of State will exercise effective control over the use of these resources. While the authority to veto specific expenditures of Venezuelan government appear to exist, it is not known whether oversight applies to broad budget lines or to detailed itemized expenditures. Moreover, there is no publicly available information regarding the frequency and substantive content of reports of the use of funds, the publication of independent audits, access to information by the Venezuelan parliament or Venezuelan civil society. This should not be confused with the beginning of a transition. As Carrie said before, a transition begins only when violated guarantees economic, social, and political are restored, and when institutions are strengthened to protect those guarantees over time. In other words, where there is sustainability. As long as Delcy Rodriguez, Jorge Rodriguez, y Diosdado Cabello retain control over institutions that are meant to be autonomous, if they command the repressive apparatus, irregular armed groups, and broad segments of both the formal and illicit economy, the regime will retain the capacity to adapt. Should external pressure ease, or should the Trump administration settle for short-term economy arrangement, these elites will be well positioned to reconfigure themselves rather than relinquish power. The context is particularly dangerous. It leaves society, or this context is dangerous because it will leave society with its hands tied in the struggle to recover civil and political rights, while simultaneously preserving Venezuela as an attractive destination for opportunistic or corrosive capital. There may be new actors involved, but the logic remains the same. Only when free and competitive elections for the National Assembly become possible, and constitutional empower to appoint the authorities for the justice system, the electoral council, fiscal oversight bodies, the attorney general's office, and the ombudsman, can we begin to speak meaningfully about a transition, of course, with the restoration of the rights and guarantees? Experience suggests that authoritarian elites rarely relinquish power willingly. They will attempt to obstruct and spoil efforts toward change. And at the international level, major powers are unlikely to abandon their spheres of influence without resistance. So, regarding the influence of Russia and China, these cases must be analyzed separately. Economic exchanges with Russia are limited. Most joint ventures have failed, and oil production within joint enterprise has declined in recent years, possibly coming to a halt. This year, in the end of last year, several media outlets reported the closure of operation of Cypriot Limited. This is a subsidiary of Rosneft. So while a recent statement from the Russian state-owned company claimed that its assets and concessions in Venezuela were acquired legitimately and that Russia will continue to develop its projects, the overall trajectory points to diminishing engagement. Defense cooperation, however, remains under close scrutiny from the United States, and it's likely to remain so, as it is an area where bipartisan consensus is relatively easy to achieve. For Russia, the war in Ukraine is the overriding priority, making it highly probable that Venezuela will receive decreasing strategic attention in this moment. China's role is different. China has been Venezuela's main trading partner since 1819 and remained its principal creditor. Recent investment expand the energy sector, both oil and electricity, as well as iron and gold extraction. Beijing will continue to collect its debt through oil shipments. That said, the hydrocarbon trade conducted through so-called dark fleets involving Russia, China, and Iran has recently suffered a significant setback. The seizure of 7 vessels have altered crude trading dynamics. 4 of these ships were part of Russia's shadow fleets. Nevertheless, monitoring by Transparencia Venezuela shows that sanctioned and covered vessels continue to operate in Venezuela territorial waters this very week. It was also confirmed that at least 1 vessel bound for China departed Venezuela without obstruction in January 14th. So I think many things have been said easily, but there is no clear picture about how this situation will end. And of course, all in Venezuela hopes that things go to transition, not only in the economic ways, but a real and genuine political and social transition.
Thank you, Christy. I believe that's why it's so important, the role of the organizations like Transparencia Venezuela and this process. What you say about the shadow fleet, this is something that should be monitored. As we hear Secretary Rubio saying there is a quarantine right now in Venezuela, but they find a way, as we see. So thank you very much for being following this. Well, we do not have much time, but there is a question here for Carrie. If you can dedicate a few minutes on that. So the questions say, how do you see the role of the Venezuelan legitimate leadership, a woman who by the way, say what she does and does what she say, working in DC for the first time, with the Venezuelan made plan that involved the diaspora as well as the Venezuelan organized inside the country in the process of transition, specifically in the second phase of Rubio's plan before an electoral event, supposedly general election, take place, let's say, in 12 months. How do you see Maria Corina Machado being part of the transition, guaranteeing the stability and hope of the vast majority of the people needed to land in a true and sustainable democracy, as most of us do not trust Delcy Rodriguez? So, Carrie, what do you think?
No, it's a great question, and I think the role that Maria Corina plays is going to be really central to, again, whether or not this is a success. Right after absolute resolve, there were a lot of comparisons. We don't want to see another Iraq, and it's not the right comparison because of Venezuelan democracy. Venezuela had a history of democracy, and not only a history of democracy, let's not forget that the Venezuelan opposition, which was united under Maria Corina Machado, I should say, historically, it was very hard to unite the opposition. They all had different strategies for countering the Maduro regime. When I was in government, it was still a situation where there were basically four sort of primary entities that would work together in the interim government, but there was still a sense that they were divergent groups. We were always insisting that they unite. They were able to unite under Maria Corina Machado, and not only were they able to unite, they actually organized their own primary elections and were able to prove that the presidential election was stolen by Maduro, and they were able to showcase that Edmundo Gonzalez, who was Maria Corina's sort of stand-in, since she was not allowed to run in the election by the Maduro regime, had won close to 70% of the vote. And that, again, doesn't even include the 8 million Venezuelans who fled Venezuela, who should have a say in their future as well. So this is all just to say that the number one reason why Venezuela is not Iraq or Afghanistan is its democracy. And Maria Corina sort of represents that better than anybody else. And so this is why, if we were not to look at her and her plan, we would be undermining our own security objectives, because she is why it isn't Iraq and Afghanistan. When you look at Iran right now, for example, what is the one thing that we consistently hear? It's very important for us to defend the protesters, but there's concerns about who comes next. There isn't, as there is in Venezuela, an obvious next person, an obvious person that already has, 80, 90%, Christy will know the numbers, the support of the Venezuelan people. And so it is really important that she play a central role. Now, I think it's also important that she not be seen as like the hand-picked person of the US, because A, she isn't, and B, she has her own priorities and her own agenda. She has been fighting for this her entire life, and she has really outperformed and overperformed all of the expectations that people had of her. So in terms of what her role should be, she and her team have been working for years on the stabilization plan, on these are the next steps. This is what you have to do first to move forward towards democracy. And then this follows, and then this follows, and then this follows. So I'm not sure of the exact timeline, if it's a 12-month process, 18-month process, whatever it is to get all of those elements of democracy in place. But she has that plan. And that plan is based on the work of organizations like Transparencia Venezuela and others that have been sort of studying this and pushing this, not just since Maduro was apprehended, but many, many years prior. So I do think that they are the ones that understand how to do this. They've been doing it. Remember, Venezuela was a democracy, so they know how to run these systems. And I also think it's important in terms of U.S. stability, because, of course, what were the three demands that the U.S. had of Maduro, or of Delcy, who is basically Maduro? It's kind of a Freudian slip. ending narcotics trafficking, which isn't going to happen under Delcy Rodriguez. There's a ton of DEA reports about her. There's ending illegal immigration. Well, people are not going to return to Venezuela. These 8 to 9 million are not going to return if we're seeing the continuation of the repression apparatus, which Delcy has been continuing, notwithstanding the release of some of these political prisoners and hopefully future amnesty. And also kicking out Russia, China, and Iran, when the very first thing Delcy Rodriguez did when she was inaugurated or sworn in was to hug the ambassadors of China, Russia, and Iran. So it is really important. She is the only person that has the credibility, the support. She has been making inroads with the military and security forces for many years as well. So again, I think she's going to have to be a really key partner here. And then, we'll run in the election, and barring any significant changes between now and the election, we'll handedly win that election, not because the U.S. has decided it, but because she has the support of the Venezuelan people. So really empowering that and making sure that we're pushing for that is what's going to be critical both for Venezuela's future and for America's future. And I think Maria Corina is the linchpin for all of this.
Thank you very much, Carrie, and I do agree with you. I truly believe that Maria Corina is our democratic compass. She represents all democratic values that the Venezuelan people naturally have. And we for sure, I believe we will continue seeing her involving in every phase. I don't think it's a matter when she entered in the second or in the last one. She has been part of it all the time, and it will continue like that. So I really thank you, all of you, for being part of this event. We run out of time. There are more questions, but we don't want to take more of your time. Really appreciate to have this opportunity and great conversation with us, this discussion. And we're looking forward to continue having time to time this, because we have a great time ahead, long process, but I believe that we will do it. We will see a democratic Venezuela very soon. Thank you all, and Ruslan.
Thank you all. I think Carrie's finishing lines are really important, and let me loop in that again to EU's experience, that unique bond also that exists transatlantic, that I think we've seen kind of fraying, but I do believe that it is very important for the future of democracy across the world, also Latin America, particularly in Venezuela. And I do think we have to cool-headedly look at what's been going on out of the daily politics of the extraction and what follows. We do agree that only painstaking engagement and work, just like in the case of we've done in the past with Ukraine and Venezuela, both from the US and the EU, but to be very much aware that China and Russia have invested heavily in seeing us fail. And in the case of Ukraine, they've gone to hot war. But I have no doubts, and we have no doubts, and our analysis on Latin America show that they will do everything possible to see us fail. So we need to be very, very careful and walk a tightrope. Thanks again, everyone. Thanks for all our wonderful speakers. Thank you, Estefania. And I look forward to welcoming you to the next global defense dialogue from CSD. Thanks a lot. Have a great evening or day if you're in the Western Hemisphere. Thank you, and good luck and all the best, and I look forward to seeing you soon again.